What's up, everybody? How y'all doing? This is your brother Shabazz coming live to you. You're tuned into the proper perspective. We're gonna get it started. We're talking about black intellectualism. That's what we're talking about tonight. Or anti-intellectualism. Y'all know what it is. Y'all, that ought to tell you enough about what we're gonna be speaking on. I'm gonna give it a minute, get the algorithm going. If you're checking out the song, I don't mind saying I produced that. Let me know what you think about the instrumental that's cutting on the background. So, we're going to get it started tonight. I might be bouncing around a little bit. I got some new toys to play with, so I'm trying to make sure I got everything properly lined up. So now that let me turn down this music. Grand rising, everybody. How y'all doing tonight? Peace to all the positive people in the universe. What's good, Richard Virginia? Hotep to the Pan-African Black world. And whoever knows how to look past the smoke and mirrors. Now tonight, what we're talking about, something is real important, something that's been, it's been some beef jumping off. We ain't gonna really talk too much about the beef. Because for the most part, that little tete-a-tete is already over with anyhow. But we are gonna talk about anti-intellectualism in America and in the black community. And we're gonna talk about how it's being weaponized in very problematic ways. Now, you've probably seen the viral clip. I know you've seen it. Marc, Lamont, Queensflip on the Joe Budden Podcast. Now, that might be the launching pad, but that's not really what I'm talking about. Hopefully, you've seen, if not the actual Native Land podcast, then maybe you've seen a couple of clips and snippets. Maybe you saw how Joe Budden did quite an extensive clapback and put them folks in their place. And that's kind of the reason why I want to talk about it. Because he was perfectly well within his rights to clap back. Now, I want to be crystal clear from the jump. My take on this whole thing really has nothing to do with Joe Budden or his podcast. Has a lot more to do with the fake conversation about anti-intellectualism and the real conversation about anti-intellectualism. Because for me, that's the real problem. Now, I gotta make sure everything is lined up correctly. So bear with me as I do a sound check. Let's see. Let me get this sound check situated. One moment, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, yeah, I think we straight. I'm hoping you can hear me. One moment, ladies and gentlemen. Yep. All right, so we're good to go. So like I said, I want to be crystal clear. Anti-intellectualism is a real problem. And it deserves a real serious discussion. But what they did on the Native Land podcast was not in any way doing justice to this problem. All they did was try to kick a brother You can't, no way, I had to fix that. You can't say that the number one podcast is nowhere near down. So they trying to use Joe Budden and his podcast as their scapegoat to make a point, even if their point was right, even if it was an honorable point to be made. The way in which they did it was dead wrong. It was inappropriate, and that's what we calling out over here on the proper perspective. Now, what actually happened? I'm gonna try to run through this real quick because like I said, I think most people are already aware of it. But I'm gonna set the stage anyhow, just make sure I cover my bases. Now, it was back on October 13th, just a few days ago, really. During a Patreon exclusive episode of the Joe Budden Podcast, co-host Marc, Lamont, and Queensflip got into a heated exchange. The argument stemmed from some behind-the-scenes conversations about pay and respect. Respect gonna be a whole lot to do with this conversation tonight. Now, at one point, Queensflip accused Hill of using a lot of tricky words, and I know that's the clip that got everything going. To which Marc immediately responded, "I say regular words that are tricky to you." Shots fired, of course. But interestingly enough, the brothers worked it out, like Chuck D and Public Enemy always said. Brothers gonna work it out. Things escalated. Both men stood up. Marc said, "Don't call me a sucker no more." They almost took it outside, but they didn't. Now, here's what's really important. Marc and Queensflip have since made up. Queensflip tweeted. He got caught up in the moment. It was all entertainment from his side. They squashed the beef. It really wasn't even beef, but they squashed the problem. They resolved the issue. They moved on. But then, and another thing, here come Native Land Podcast trying to see if they can get some clickbait. And they enter the chat. They enter the discussion. 3 days later, on October 16th, Native Land Podcast, hosted by Angela Rye, or if I said that wrong, I do apologize. It's either Rye or Ree, and I get it mixed up. Tiffany Cross, Andrew Gillum, and Bakari Sellers. They dropped an episode, and see, here's what really got me going. From the title alone, it's like, now they titled their episode Joe Budden's Podcast and the Dumbing Down of America. Can we pause for a second? The idea of trying to pin the dumbing down of America onto one man, onto one person's podcast is highly suspect at the least. Now, I will say this, and I may come back to this later. If you got the nerve to call out the dumbing down of America, if you really want to go there, then you need to start at the top of the country. If there is an argument to be made, if there is a conversation to be made about the dumbing down of America, wouldn't you look at the top, y'all know what I'm talking about. Y'all know who I'm talking about. You would look at Dear Leader. If America has been dumbed down, then it is absolutely a reflection of, a link to its leadership, not one brother's podcast. But I'm going to read you a little bit of what they said, because I don't want to stay on my little soapbox about it. Now, Tiffany Cross said this guy who's talking, somewhere in the midst there, she said this guy's talking, I don't respect his opinion. Now, see, this is a problem. Like, I don't have to agree with your opinion, but I can respect the fact that you have one. But she goes on. She says Marc should not be on this podcast. How dare she? You got me clutching my pearls. Like, are you his manager? Are you in charge of what he is supposed to be doing? And she goes on further to say they put dumb people on TV sometimes just because you have more likes than followers. Now, the arrogance. I mean, did she forget they put her co-host was on TV? Is she one of the dumb people that was on TV sometimes because her co-host got fired? But okay, let me calm down. I'm just giving you a briefing. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. Now, later, somewhere in the midst of the show, Angela Rye came back with, of course, Marc is welcome here anytime. I don't know about the rest of them. I don't think that means that we should be foreclosed to having discussions that are tough or where we don't think people are our peers or we're on the same level. Oh, really? It sounds like you do. Now, for me, the stench of arrogance coming off of both of their comments, Angela's and Tiffany's. But to some extent, at least at that part in that little section, a little bit more, I direct a little bit more of my ire towards Angela's comments, it's twisting me in my own daggone head. Now, I consider myself a fan. Well, I used to be a fan of the Native Land Podcast. What actually brought me to the Native Land Podcast was Tiffany Cross, more so than Angela. But that's that's not necessarily a shot. That's not a shot. I was just more familiar with Tiffany because of her time on MSNBC. I used to be an avid watcher of MSNBC programming. And clearly, of course, right along with everybody else, when you say something, when you're black and you say something a little too truthful, you get the axe. But that's also why it's so shocking that people who have experienced corporate media hatchet work will then take an opportunity to go to work and do the same thing or try to do the same thing to other black people that got done to them. Now, Tiffany Cross admitted that she's never actually listened to a full Joe Budden podcast episode. Well, if you got the balls to admit you ain't never watched the full episode, you should have the integrity to keep your opinions to yourself. She says, "This is not my ministry. I have no desire to engage the flips of the world." Now, I ain't necessarily the biggest fan of Queensflip, but I don't disrespect the brother. I just wouldn't say nothing. So that whole statement, that didn't even need to be aired. I have no desire to engage. If you had no desire to engage, then why even talk about it? Why even bring it up? But let me calm down. I always got to remind myself to calm down before I say something that'll get my channel banned again. But we got a problem. I got a problem with this type of attitude, with this type of arrogance. I don't like it at all. It's classism. It's elitism. And, well, I'll just say, as I proceed in the show, hopefully I'm going to dig a little deeper. Now, I will say, let me give a shout out or big ups, enough respect to Andrew Gillum, because to his credit, he basically said, "I never listened to the Joe Budden podcast before. This is the first clip I've ever seen of it." So he's at least trying to be like, I ain't trying to jump on this bandwagon the sisters got rolling right now. So shout out to the idea of letting cooler heads prevail, and especially in the midst of a storm. But quite frankly, that ain't necessarily enough to make me continue watching, to allow me, to convince me to continue watching. But I don't know. I ain't made that final decision yet. But I will say, some things, once the damage is done, it's done. The die was cast and set. The narrative was framed. Joe Budden's podcast is part of the dumbing down of America. Yeah, not the Trump administration. Not the eradication of the Department of Education. If anything, Taco Man's current administration and their campaign tricks is the heart and soul of dumbing down the country. And that's a far cry from what we get, what's involved, what relates to the Joe Budden podcast. But that's why we're talking about it. Now, let me make sure. All right, we good. So, I want to be clear about something. I'm not saying we can't have conversations about anti-intellectualism. I'm here for it. I'll double down. We need to have these conversations. But why can't we have those conversations without dragging each other through the mud, without pulling each other under the bus? Now, quite frankly, none of us are expendable in our worlds, in our communities. None of us should be expendable. Well, okay. I'll give you some grace if you say the Clarence Thomases of the community might be expendable, but that's another story. Now, so in the spirit of intellectualism versus anti-intellectualism, I will again give Tiffany Cross some credit. She brings up some legitimate facts, some legitimate concerns that should be talked about. And they should be talked about on a regular basis. They should be talked about not to put anybody down. They should be talked about as, how do we resolve these issues? Now, she said only 17% of Black fourth graders score at or above proficiency in reading. That is definitely a problem. But you know what? You can't get to a solution on that problem by talking about Joe Budden's podcast. So if we're going to have a conversation about intellectualism and anti-intellectualism, well, you certainly can't be under the impression that it's intelligent to try and discuss fourth graders' reading scores as if it is hinged upon the Joe Budden podcast. But I'm supposed to be giving credence and credit. So yes, she also discussed social media being correlated with poorer cognitive outcomes, while she stars on a social media oriented podcast. She brings up the idea that excessive AI use has cognitive impacts comparable to a concussion. And these are real issues. They deserve real conversation and discussion. But here's the problem. Using someone's name and platform for clicks, and especially using their platform for clicks without any proper context. That's supposed to be the intellectualism that you put on display. Now, all of the hosts admit they don't regularly watch the podcast, Joe Budden's. So how intellectual is it to take one single viral moment or two single viral moments out of how many years of daily curated content, and you indict the entire platform? Now, what if we did that for her, for their show, for their podcast? Now, quite frankly, I'm like, not like the brother need me to say shout out, but shout out to the way in which Joe Budden handled it. He said, make the point that you want to make, whatever it is, but keep his name out of it. And I'm like, exactly. That's because, now, again, I'll be the first to say, or I don't mind admitting, I don't mind saying, I watch the Joe Budden podcast. I don't watch it all the time. I don't watch it religiously. I'm not an avid watcher. I'm not paying for a Patreon. But I watch as much as I can when I catch the clips and when I catch the episodes or whatever. I'm familiar enough with it to know that the fight itself was not the full context of what the show is about. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. And even being that familiar with it, I wouldn't have jumped online and started telling a whole bunch of people, look at the anti-intellectual energy. Now, I will say that me personally, I do feel as though, I do think that the addition of Marc Lamont Hill has been a positive. And there's been plenty of episodes that I saw, hey, quite frankly, before his edition and since his edition, there are still episodes that I may say, I might got an issue or problem with this, that, or the other, or one particular conversation. But as a whole, there's absolutely no way you should fix your mouth to start calling people dumb just because you don't value the opinions that they hold. That's when we get to this intellectual elitism that really, I got a problem with that. I mean, she actually said Queensflip and others are beneath having conversations with. Actually intimating, and not even intimating, she outright said it. Marc Lamont Hill should come home to more intellectual spaces. the implication that entertainment-focused platforms have no value. See, class, respectability, politics, elitism, and we ain't supposed to be like, buying into the gender war. But this is the same dynamic that's always used. What is it? It's divide and conquer. And we can even look to, it reeks of the talented 10th, looking down on everyone else. And the worst part about it is all of the people who buy into the talented 10th ideology, and they buy into it, and they honor W.B. Du Bois. And they say that, but here's the thing. The man who formulated the talented 10th ideology, once he saw how people were taking it and misusing it and misapplying it, he said, whoa, hold up, stop the presses, pump your brakes. Once he saw what the people on the ground was doing with it, he came back and said, no. Y'all got it wrong. Y'all got it effed up. That's not what the F I meant. But Coon's going to keep cooning. So they ignore his correction. Now, I'm not calling the Native Land Podcast Coon. I'm talking about the talented 10th and the ideology. Now, I am calling them people, if you espouse the talented 10th ideology in the wrong way, yeah, that's some Coon stuff. Especially when the man that authored the formula, the statements, said, don't use it that way. You can't ignore his correction. He did not formulate it as a tool of division. So the idea that only credentialed voices in polished spaces matter, that idea, if this don't reek of the Southern Confederacy, the idea that you must be credentialed and you must be from a polished background in order to matter, in order to posit meaningful commentary. Now look, I'm the last person that would ever try to cast doubt or cast aspersions or castigate, throw shade on anybody with credentials. I respect the knowledge, the wisdom, understanding. I respect the grind. I respect the collegiate lane. I come from the collegiate lane. But I ain't never been cool with college or collegiate arrogance. I ain't never been cool with elitism. I call it out in my regular, in my daily life. Not that I call it out every day. I don't encounter it every day. But when I do encounter it, I call it out. I can't stand it. Equally so. Because I don't like divide and conquer. So just as much as I don't like the collegiate folk who try to use their college background to look down on brothers and sisters that didn't go that route, I don't like the brothers and sisters that didn't go that route who start puffing their chests up and saying, you ain't nothing, you just a college person. I don't like elitism on either side of the coin. I don't like if you think you're more polished and you're better than those who didn't. I don't like if you feel like because you didn't, you got to prove something. You ain't got to prove nothing to nobody. Neither side does. Now, I will say, well, maybe I won't say that. I got the urge to shout out and send a few F-bombs and colorful expletives to put everybody in their place, but I ain't going to do that. Let me continue with the show. Because ignoring the context, ignoring the nuance. You know, Marc chose to be on that podcast. He's been there since 2024. So, you know, almost like, well, 2024, 2025, you can count that like 2 years. He's been there. He's been knocking it out the park. He brings diverse perspectives to a massive Black audience. As a matter of fact, the tension that they trying to comment on was about workplace dynamics and respect. It wasn't even about intellectualism. Now, anytime it's anybody on the job, even if there's a hint of a rumor that somebody might be, you know, getting cut out of some bread, you know it's going to be some rough feathers. That has nothing to do with intellectualism. But like I said earlier, you know, Joe Budden made excellent points. And to be honest, his clapback was the clapback of clapbacks. Like, you know, he pretty much ethered them. He said, you title it that. And then admittedly say, I don't look at the show. I mean, who wouldn't take offense to that? If somebody, literally, like I said, if somebody were to start clapping on the Native Land podcast and then say, well, I don't even watch it, but I mean, what kind of name is that anyhow? They not native. I ain't never watched the show, but it clearly can't be about nothing. I heard one of the hosts broke into tears one day. These jumping to conclusions. What is it? Hasty generalizations is what they call it in English class. Because again, at the end of the day, look, the Joe Budden podcast is a raw, unfiltered. Some people might even say it's messy, but at the end of the day, it's real, it's authentic. And it does engage Black intellectual discourse happening. You get to see it unfold in real time, flaws and all. That's the value. Now, just because this person or that person happens to hold or express an opinion that you don't agree with, you are not the architect and the author of what is genuine and what is valid. I mean, I've heard opinions from several of the members on the show that I disagree with. I've heard opinions from the Native Land podcast that I don't agree with. But I wouldn't jump out there and say, oh, because I disagree with you, you're ignorant, you're dumb, you're not in my ministry. And I'll even go so far as to say, like one of the other guys, Parks, on the show, I'm not gonna say he said it best, but the point that he made, he said you can't just spitball some and then claim you're an intellectual. You can't go off of a 30-second clip and then claim you're an intellectual. And I'm like, that's the thing, because if you really wanted to hold up the idea of being an intellectual, if that's what your show is about, if you really wanted your critique of the Joe Budden podcast to have any weight, to have any value, then what you should have done the intellectual thing that you were talking about. You should have done your research and you should have had a conversation and a discussion about that. You know, like, because even if you're an intellectual, if you're truly an intellectual, and let's take it back to the college lane anyhow, since it seems like that's where they're more comfortable. Well, you know, when you go to college, they expect you to write thesis papers to exhibit your intellectualism, your intellectuality. And one of the things that they tell you and teach you and train you in doing is, first of all, you got to have a strong thesis. Okay, so even though I may disagree with their thesis, they got one. But in order to get any kind of a passing score, Your thesis must be supported with 3 rock solid supports, which is where they fail, which is where the intellectualism disappears. Now, you might say they got 2 supports, one of which is weaker than water. Like, this ain't a shit that ain't disrespecting water. But water is weak when you compare it to some hard liquor. And the other one that actually may have had some actual meat to it, it gets buried. It gets drowned out by the weak support where they spent most of their time. So if, for instance, since I'm working on this little weird sounding strange metaphor, if that episode was an English paper, a thesis paper, a dissertation, it would have failed. It would have got laughed out of the department. Y'all see what I did with that English background of mine. Even Queensflip responded, asking if Angela Rye was saying, it's too late for, you say it's too late for me to learn? Or you said I'm too ignorant to learn? And it was a rhetorical question. He know what they were saying. Now, it's just, the disrespect is just unbelievable. Now, the real conversation, like I said, if you want to have why not just have the show about anti-intellectualism? Why you got to pull them into it? Why don't you just do a show on anti-intellectualism without throwing shots, without throwing shade? And then the nerve of people who like to throw shots and throw shade and then hide their hands and hide behind cover. Why not just stand your ground? Here's what you should have been talking about. Because, again, credit to Tiffany, she brought up some real issues, and then there's absolutely no deep dive whatsoever. But the systemic issues, how social media platforms are designed to shorten attention spans. Okay, that's a real problem. It deserves a real conversation. Funny how they didn't. A systemic issue, how the education system is failing Black children, but they rather talk about Joe Budden. How economic inequality limits access to quality education. How AI, if not properly understood, that's the thing, because even in that point when she brought it up, even that was mishandled. The idea is not that AI dulls critical thinking. The idea is that AI, not properly understood, not properly utilized, can dull critical thinking. So even the way, like I said, even the way she framed that part of the problem, that blanket statement, just like the rest of the show, it reeks of anti-intellectualism in and of itself. It's poor craftsmanship. It's poor scholarship. They could have had a show. They could have discussed how reading and education are sometimes stigmatized in the community, in our community. But dare I say, all across this country, because you go and do the research, I did. Even Harvard, even Yale, even all those lily white institutions, all of them filled with white folk. And the professors at those universities are saying, this new crop of students don't cut it like the old ones do. So you can have a real conversation about anti-intellectualism in this entire country. It ain't got nothing to do with Joe Budden. It's just like way back in the day when all those people tried to say every ill in the Black community stems from hip hop, that rap stuff. When clearly the ills that they were talking about had been going on for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years before this rap stuff was ever even invented. That's how low bar the intellectual conversation that they're trying to have is. They didn't bring up misinformation and how it spreads faster than truth. To some extent, they participated in the misinformation. How we can bring, what about how we can bridge the gap between different communication styles? There's an intellectual conversation for you. But none of these salient points, none of these critical issues have anything to do with the Joe Budden podcast, whether there was or was not ever going to be a fight. Now, here's a solution. Because again, and another thing, if you were really an intellectual, and here's the reason why I have so much of a problem with what happened, with what they did. But if you're really an intellectual, and you're up there trying to assassinate an independently owned black man's company and his business, that alone should be problematic in and of itself. So to the point where it's like, you get with your people, y'all brainstorming ideas on what you're going to talk about. And let's say, yeah, so it comes up as an idea. All of y'all should have enough knowledge, wisdom, understanding, and integrity to be like, I don't know if that's the right angle we want to go with. And that should have been, they never should have been an episode handled, managed, and declared and produced the way in which it was produced. That you ain't even got the nerve. You ain't even got the guts. Dare I say, you might not have the intellect to even discuss the solutions, to even discuss the actual problems. Because don't get it twisted. Just bringing up the salient facts, 17% of, 30% of, just stating the facts, that's not having an intellectual conversation. If you're going to have an intellectual conversation, or if you're going to have a conversation about the lack of intellectual conversations, then you need to do the work. They could have been talking about how we come together and invest in early childhood literacy programs. No, let's just talk about Joe. They could have come together and said, how can we teach media literacy and critical thinking? No, let's just talk about Joe and Marc. What about creating more accessible educational content? Since they want to talk about the problem of intellectual products on the market, in the market, they could have talked about celebrating diverse forms of intelligence and communication, because all intelligence don't come across the same way. What we shouldn't be doing, what they shouldn't be doing, is using individual platforms or people as convenient scapegoats. That's what white folk do. That's what the white supremacists do. That's what the divide and conquer COINTELPRO tactics do. And especially if you was going to draw down, then you should have done your homework and knew completely what exactly it is that you were going to be criticizing. Now, these puzzle pieces that I'm dropping on you, I hope you're putting them together to see the bigger picture. Because there's always a bigger picture, a broader pattern. Because it's not just about one podcast episode. It's about a pattern. It's the same energy as when academics look down on street knowledge, as when credentialed folks dismiss lived experience. And we see that, and we've seen that even in the hallowed halls of academia. Black people had to fight because there are aspects and pockets and lanes and realms of study that are deeply rooted and deeply connected to outside the books. Sometimes they call it folklore, folkways, but they are legitimate fields of study that do not center around how many degrees you got. So political commentators mocking entertainment spaces, like, yo, stay in your lane a little bit, maybe, huh? People confuse vocabulary with wisdom. Now, we could really draw down on that. You can say, well, that was part of the problem on the show. Yeah, it was. But why? But if you're going to have that conversation, then have that conversation. The way in which it was handled, you just adding more fuel to the fire. You just being as gossipy as you say they are. What is the problem with a brother like Marc Lamont Hill, who apparently appears to be quite brilliant at navigating two entirely different realms and worlds and walks of life? Yes, he got a PhD from Penn. He teaches at Temple and Morehouse. He even got a show on Al Jazeera. And yeah, he's on the Joe Budden podcast. Why? That's what Black community is supposed to be. You know, when they built Black Wall Street, it wasn't just elitists. Black Wall Street, no matter what city it was built in, it wasn't just the rich brothers and sisters. It was full on community. The brothers and sisters with PhDs, the brothers and sisters with master's degrees, the brothers and sisters with bachelorates, the brothers and sisters with certificates in this, that, and the other, in the trades, in HVAC, in electricity or electrician, etc., etc. It was everybody. Everybody respected and recognized everybody else's genius and intellectualness of it. But that's too much like right. For the Native Land Podcast, the issue shouldn't be where you have your conversations. The issue should be how you have your conversations and whether you're coming with good faith. Can we underline? Can we boldface print? Can we underscore good faith? Because that's the problem with that entire episode. It was not a good faith conversation about intellectualism or anti-intellectualism. It was just, let's just talk about Joe. But let me calm down. I try to maintain my respect for the Native Land Podcast. And I'm not saying that I'll never watch it again. It's not in my ministry. I recognize that they are accomplished people doing important work. But this particular move, using Joe Budden's platform and name to make a point about anti-intellectualism without actually engaging in the full context. You know that saying, when you point one finger at somebody else, it's three more pointed back at you. What they did was just, it wasn't even a good attempt. It was fumbling a cheap shot. Some might say it was an opportunity for clickbait. At best, it was sloppy analysis, poor analysis, based on incomplete information. Your professor would have given you an F. And we can have conversations about anti-intellectualism without tearing down any Black platforms. We can critique without condescension. We can disagree without disrespect. Most importantly, we can recognize that intellectual curiosity exists in many forms. Like I said, it's a whole lot of, intellectual conversations that they do have on the show. But just because they're not rooted in whatever you studied and majored in. So whether we talk about or we sit in a boardroom or a barbershop, whether we're at a university or a podcast studio, especially those of us with the larger platforms, do better. Let's have real conversations about real issues without using each other as stepping stools or punching bags. And here's, again, I'm going to draw down on this before I get up out of here, because here's my prima facie example. Because Tiffany listed 17% Black fourth grade literacy rates, social media destroying cognitive function, AI usage comparable to a concussion. She said kids can't summarize paragraphs. She said she wanted to discuss the dying and the death of Black intellectualism. So where was that conversation? I watched the whole episode. Zero discussion on education policy, zero discussion on how to fix literacy rates, zero discussion on systemic solutions, zero discussion on curriculum reform, zero discussion on funding inequalities. Well, actually, Bakari brought it up for about 60 seconds before they went right back into talking about Joe Budden. So you title your episode The Dumbing Down of America, and you spent 70% of the episode gossiping about some podcast beef that wasn't even real. You list statistics about 8th graders not being able to summarize paragraphs, and then you spend 40 minutes not providing intellectual analysis of those problems. This is your show. See, you know, when you were on MSNBC, you could hide behind, well, they wouldn't let me go deep. They only gave me 10 minutes for the segment. This is your podcast. You can go deep as long as you want to. And you chose to talk about Joe Budden. You complained about anti-intellectualism while engaging in the exact behavior that you criticize, trying to use viral moments for clicks instead of substantive discussion. I wonder why. Now, if you were really intellectuals, or if you were really behaving like intellectuals, get that right. And if you really wanted to have the intellectual conversation that you hinted at, you would have done a deep dive into the education policy. I don't recall anybody mentioning Linda McMahon and the Department of Education. You could have analyzed the root cause of literacy decline, and you could have informed the community on what it was. You could have examined social media algorithms and their cognitive impacts. Nah, you just threw it out there like another buzzword. Did you discuss? Did you even think? Did y'all even try to formulate 5 minutes to talk about proposed legislative solutions to these problems? Or community-based interventions to these problems? Now, you did have the brother say, well, what I do with my kids. So is that the extent of your intellectualism? Let's have one sentence. You could have planned, plot, strategized. You could have interviewed educators and brought them onto the show. You could have brought on researchers and policy experts. No, let's just talk about Joe. That's not intellectual discourse, but you want to talk about the death and the dying of Black intellectualism. You are participating in it. You didn't even provide a good high school book report worth of information on the death and the dying of Black intellectualism at a time when a master's thesis was suggested, a doctor's dissertation would be needed on such weighty conversation topics. And all you did was provide a book report that was tantamount to reading the back cover of the book and act like you read the whole thing. That's the problem I got. How you talking about anti-intellectualism and you not having that intellectual conversation? But that's me on my soapbox. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, pro-Black, Pan-African people all over the world, let me know where you're watching, where you're listening from. Put something in the comments for me. If you made it this far, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the native land folk were out of line, or do you think Joe Budden and his platform deserves the criticism? Now, with that is the question. That's me landing my plane, ladies and gentlemen. This is your brother Shabazz. Sometimes you're Professor Shabazz. This is the proper perspective. If you want to, we can duke it out in the comment section. Like, share, and subscribe is the name of the game, and I will see you on the next live.